Just say, excuse me, I'm on the phone. I'm talking to Mike Graham, the greatest radio show in the history of radio. I'll be right with you. That's what I would have done. Anyway, never mind. We're going to talk instead to James Snell, Senior Advisor for Special Initiatives at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, also writer for The Spectator, because we've got front pages today on The Telegraph, if not least, talking about why tanks need to be supplied to Ukraine and Germany needs to get off their backside and help out. Stop stalling the tanks deal, according to NATO. And we've got our own Secretary of State for Defence and the US counterpart visiting Germany, I believe, today to try and convince the Germans to get on with it. James, very good morning to you.
Hello, Mike.
What is the situation in Germany? Because the Germans seem to be sort of vacillating slightly here, don't they? They're not entirely certain whether the public will be behind them. And they never have been, really, because these were the same German government, were they not, who only supplied some helmets at the start of the war and were kind of very reticent to get involved any more militarily than that.
Yeah, exactly. They started out with very limited support indeed, some helmets, a hospital, a mobile hospital, and so on.
Right.
And they were very slowly bounced into giving more equipment over time. I must say, in Germany itself, there isn't a very strong division. It seems the division is within the coalition, and it's essentially the SDP of Olaf Scholz against everybody else who fully understands that Ukraine needs assistance, more assistance, and that main battle tanks have to be part of that.
But is there not a rump of the public, and certainly in the US there would be, in this country there are some, no, maybe not many, but possibly more in Germany, who think actually we shouldn't be giving them as much aid as we are giving them? You know, when will it stop and where does it end?
Yeah, people certainly do say this. And in Germany they have a very classic red-brown coalition of Die Linke, which is the extreme left-wing party, and the AfD, which is essentially a kind of proto-fascist party. They say that. In the US, it's represented by people like Tucker Carlson, which is to the right of basically everybody else in Britain.
Right.
But I must say, among people who don't, as it were, have to subsist on a diet of intention alone, most people understand that the Ukrainian war is very important, that we're really not spending very much on it. It's something like 4% of the US defense budget has effectively destroyed Russia as an offensive power. And of course, we spent most of the 20th century preparing to throw Russia back if it crossed the Rhine and attempted to take Paris. So we're really getting good value from our money here. And I think many Europeans especially, the Americans are isolated enough that ultimately very little affects them on their continent, oceans away. But we understand as Europeans, or probably should, that a reintroduction of land warfare in our continent will have disastrous consequences. I think it's very useful sometimes to go back to February and think what people anticipated might happen and what they feared. And the thing they most feared is that not only would Russia overrun Ukraine, which of course proved very untrue, but that they wouldn't stop on the other side, that they would go out into Moldova to link up with the Transnistrian Republic, where there are thousands of Russian regulars, that they might try and carve off one of the Baltic states as a real test to NATO. And if they'd done that, that would have been a serious global conflict. And we have nothing like that, and we won't so long as Ukraine continues to win.
Yes. But is that more to do with Russia's inability to win rather than Ukraine's ability to defend itself? Because Ukraine is getting absolutely pummeled. And when we see video footage like what we saw last weekend, where many, many towns and cities are literally being just laid to waste, and it's beginning to look a bit like Syria looked after a few years of the Russians invading it, it might be that the Russians aren't winning, but they're ruining a country.
Yeah, they are destroying Ukraine, and it's very distressing. As someone who covered the Syrian war for 10 years, it's eerily similar in many ways. But the truth is that, much like the Russian force in Syria was actually very small and could have been thoroughly defeated if the Syrian opposition had been given anti-air weapons, for example. It's a very small footprint. It could have been rolled up by the United States in a weekend. The Americans could have destroyed the Russian Air Force and the Assad Air Force in Syria in an afternoon if they wished to.
Yeah.
So it's a larger invasion than that. But even so, the Russians have certainly been incompetent. The Ukrainians have been fantastically brave, brilliantly tactically adept, and they've made fantastic use of everything they've had, even at the beginning when they didn't have very much. And they've consistently outperformed our expectations of them, and I think we owe it to them ultimately to appreciate that they will win if given the tools.
Yes, but then I suppose we're also entitled to ask the question, how long does it go on for, and when would we expect to see the tide turning, if you like, and Russia just disappearing and leaving?
Yes, and I think this is a fairly significant question. Certainly Michael Clarke, who's later Russi, says this is a generational war which can go on for many years. I think that's certainly possible. But at the same time, I think the best possible option that we have for a quick and easy solution to this conflict is a dramatic, decisive Ukrainian victory before August,
right,
which some people like General Ben Hodges, who's formerly the US commanding general in Europe, say is certainly possible, again, with the right tools.
And what about Germany then? How important is it that they kind of join up forces with NATO? Is it a weakening of NATO if they stay outside of the alliance?
It is, in effect, but it's less necessarily their influence, which is relatively small. They needed, for example, a $100 billion infusion into their armed forces, much of which hasn't actually appeared, it seems, in any substantive action since February. Germany is still a relatively minor military player. The serious question, and the reason why the rest of the NATO powers are profoundly annoyed by Germany, is the re-export prohibitions they put on their hardware, because they are a major military exporter more than they are a major military power. They have exported their Leopard tanks in particular to most European countries, really. I mean, we in Britain are alone in fielding the Challenger, aside from Jordan, and most of the other European powers have Leopards, and the Germans have stopped them from being exported. So it's Germany dropping the prohibition on Poland, Finland, Denmark, other countries like that, giving Ukraine Leopards.
Yeah,
rather than the German effort itself.
Yeah. And what about the sort of allies of Russia, if you like? And if they're not allies, they're certainly enablers, if you like. The United Arab Emirates, for example, China, places where Russia can still do business. Presumably that's also prolonging this whole thing.
Yeah, it certainly is. In the sense that, of course, the Russian economy is significantly being diminished. If it were a democracy, the government would have been overthrown within weeks of the sort of sanctions that were posed on Russia being posted, essentially. But they've been able to carry on for a little longer because they aren't a representative political system. I must say, the clear and obvious thing, in Europe now, we are discussing prescribing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, because they are a terrorist organization by definition. And all sorts of other geopolitical events have gone on to show us that there's no dealing with Iran at all in its current state. The way they're cracking down on protesters, the fact that the nuclear deal is basically dead, all of those things. And one of the obvious things, it seems to me, that we can do to hurt Iran in every way is to prohibit it from being involved in this war on Russia's side. There are IRGC officials in occupied Crimea at the moment, which Iran actually doesn't recognize as being part of Russia, operating their drones, which are being used by Russia to target Ukrainian cities. Now, modern air defense, I think, will probably diminish the effect of those Iranian drones on the battlefield and on the civilian arena.
Right.
But nonetheless, they're a serious weapon. They're being used by Iranians fighting on the Russian side. And it's incumbent upon us, because we have a pretty significant sanctions regime against Iran in the first place, to interdict weapons shipments and to prevent them from intervening so significantly on Russia's side as they have.
And do you think the deal today will be successful with Britain and America trying to get Germany to join in?
It depends. I think they will eventually be bounced into it, because they have eventually been bounced into many things. They've decided eventually that there was going to be a very weird, they call it a ring tausch or a ring rausch, which was this idea that they would give their modern weapons to countries like Greece, and Greece would offload Cold War era crap on Ukraine instead. So that was the old system, and that was implemented under very heavy protest by the Germans, and they eventually folded to that as well. I have no reason to believe fundamentally that, as obstinate as the current SDP chancellor is, that he won't be bounced into something else. Because ultimately, it's not just his legacy on the line here, which he probably will be damned by history, whatever he does at this point. But it's his political life as well, because patience is running out domestically.
I think so. James, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. James Snell, Senior Advisor for Special Initiatives at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Fascinating situation in Germany, actually. I'm sure we'll keep you updated throughout the course.